Welcome to History 2502, United States History 2, the history of the United States from 1877 to the present, which means for us the end of the Cold War. We choose the year 1877 as our starting point because that is the year that federal troops left the defeated South after the Civil War, bringing an end to a period we know as Reconstruction. However, we are not going to begin with the year 1877, but instead start in 1865, 1866, so that we may understand what Reconstruction was and its lasting effects on the United States. From that point, we shall move forward through the years and decades in which the United States becomes a major industrial and imperial power, its role in two global wars, its fundamental change economically, socially, and politically during the Great Depression and other financial crises, its prominence as a world leader through the Cold War, its struggles to bring full equality to all citizens, especially during the Civil Rights era, the crisis of the 1960s and the Vietnam War, and finally the New World Order that emerged at the end of the Cold War. Throughout this class, we are going to be highlighting specific themes that will emerge over and over again. Obviously, economics, politics, social and cultural norms will be there. We're also going to focus a great deal on race and on gender throughout. So please keep a keen eye out and a sharp ear out for those themes as they come up over and over again in the lessons. So now let us begin with the period we know as Reconstruction. Given the current events of today, especially in this city of New Orleans, understanding Reconstruction is a major task that many of us should undertake. Reconstruction is still debated about to this day. There are those who would say that Reconstruction, in truth, has not quite come to an end, and I would find that to be a very truthful argument. The current situation with our monuments in the city and the debate over how we remember the Confederacy and the past and the Civil War leads many to believe that we've not quite resolved the Civil War and Reconstruction in our lives. At the end of the Civil War, the South was completely destroyed. Richmond, Virginia was among many, burned out. Only the Confederate capital, which had been the old State House, remained. Atlanta, Georgia, burned to the ground. Charleston, South Carolina, and by the way, that street that you see there is the same street on which the Emmanuel African Methodist Church or Methodist Episcopal Church, where Dylann Roof shot those poor people to death, is that very street there. Columbia, South Carolina, looking out from the state capitol onto the wrecked city below it. More so even than buildings, you had suddenly hundreds of thousands of individuals in the South who had once been enslaved were now free through the 13th Amendment. They were free, but they had little other than their own freedom. They had no jobs, no prospects, and the South did not quite know what to do with all these newly freed people, and the country did not know what to do with all these newly freed people. So Reconstruction can be accurately described as a time of wounds healed and wounds opened. So we're going to look at Reconstruction. Then we'll see one of the principal figures of the Reconstruction period, Tennessee Johnson, President Andrew Johnson, that is. We'll see the stages of Reconstruction as we go through them. Presidential Reconstruction, in which the President of the United States attempted to reintegrate the South. And Congressional Reconstruction, where Congress takes control of Reconstruction from the President. And then the resulting struggle between President and Congress leads to the impeachment. You see in the picture below are colored senators and representatives. Reconstruction saw an unprecedented increase in the involvement and voting and office holding of African Americans, where they were senators and representatives, judges, and one even became governor of a state, the great state of Louisiana. Historians regularly set Reconstruction as from 1866 until 1877. Officially, we call it the physical rebuilding of the devastated South after the Civil War, where we literally go back into the cities and start rebuilding them. We start trying to get the economy back on its feet. But there is also the social and political reintegration of the southern states. An end to secession, an end to the division in the country, an end to slavery. It also means an unprecedented increase in black political involvement, series of new labor regulations, and new state constitutions. Now, all this sounds very good, but Reconstruction had many problems from the start. And one of the biggest problems is that the man who probably could have pulled off Reconstruction as gently as possible while at the same time achieving what it wanted to achieve was dead. Abraham Lincoln had been shot and killed in 1865, assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, and his leadership was sorely lacking in this. His successor, Andrew Johnson, was not the man that Abraham Lincoln was completely unwilling and unable to compromise, and in many ways wrecked Reconstruction for a time. On the other side in Congress were radical Republicans, and radical Republicans dominated Congress at this time. They enacted a Reconstruction that was very harsh and punitive and incurred a great deal of Southern resentment. And what happened as a result of this is that the South would eventually plot and plan and return to white supremacy. Andrew Johnson is the man who assumes the presidency upon the death of Lincoln. If ever a man was an accidental president, it was this man. He was really temperamentally unsuited for the office and in many ways overwhelmed by the office. Something to understand about Andrew Johnson. Whereas Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, Andrew Johnson was a Democrat. He was born into poverty like Lincoln. Actually, he was a year older than Lincoln. However, his poverty did not lead him to the same ends that led Lincoln. Lincoln developed a gentle nature and a more, shall we say, benevolent attitude toward his fellow man. Johnson's poverty made him a very, very bitter and very angry man. Johnson was a tailor by trade. Johnson blames the Southern elite for the Civil War. That is, the masters of the big house, the big plantation owners. He was not part of that class. He's the only Southern senator not to resign his office. But this does not make him some egalitarian. He was extremely racist, very unwilling to compromise, and it was becoming quite evident that Andrew Johnson was attempting to build a base of support for a run for a term as president in his own right. And he was going to do this by reaching out to the poorer and more disaffected whites of the South. Even before the assassination of Lincoln, there was a growing split in the Republican Party. Remember that when one party achieves total power and total prominence, as the Republican Party did during the Civil War, very soon it starts to show some fractures from within. Lincoln was the leader of the moderates in the Republican Party, whereas the radical Republicans were sort of like Jacobins from the French Revolution. They were very harsh, very strident. They were led by Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, representative and majority leader in the House, and Charles Sumner, who was the leading abolitionist in the Senate, the very loud, bombastic Charles Sumner from Massachusetts. This growing split in the Republican Party will have a great deal of effect on the outcome of Reconstruction. What had happened during the Civil War? Southern cities were burned to the ground. Atlanta, Memphis, Charleston, Columbia, and so forth. Interestingly enough, one of the cities not burned to the ground during the Civil War was New Orleans because it surrendered rather than endure a siege. Plantations were destroyed. River levees went unattended. The infrastructure of the South, such as it was completely destroyed. There was very little capital, that is, cash money in the South. And one of the reasons for this is much of the wealth of the South had been tied up into slaves. And so the freeing of slaves meant that hundreds of millions of dollars literally disappeared. And there was war weariness. The Civil War had gone on for 4 very long, tragic years, and people were tired. Now, when Lincoln decides to start reconstructing the southern states, you get an evidence of this in his second inaugural address, where he says, "With malice toward none and with charity toward all." That is going to be his template. Now, 2 years prior to this, Louisiana had been one of the first states to fall to the south, well, specifically the city of New Orleans in southeast Louisiana. And Lincoln created what was known as the 10% plan. That is, if 10% of the eligible voters in a particular state would take an oath of loyalty to the Union, then that state would be allowed to write a new constitution and join the Union again. The problem in this was that in Louisiana, almost immediately they write a new constitution that denies voting rights to African Americans. Lincoln was okay with this, actually. But the radicals, like Stevens and Sumner, said, no, I don't think so. That's not what we're fighting the Civil War for. And so the 10% plan, which was more like Lincoln throwing spaghetti against the wall, let's see what sticks, does not seem to be working out very well, and so Lincoln's going to move on to something else. At least he plans to move on to something else. One of the reasons why you had all these freed slaves in the South is that the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed into order in 1862 and went into effect in 1863. That freed all slaves in Confederate-held territory. That didn't free all slaves, though, because there were border states that did not join the Confederacy and stayed within the Union. The 13th Amendment, passed by Congress in 1865, prohibited slavery forever, and then was sent to the states, and 27 of the 36 states ratified the 13th Amendment in 1865. And so when 3/4 of the states ratify an amendment, it becomes the law of the land. And so that frees all slaves throughout the country, including the slaves in the border states. Now, what are some of the problems with presidential reconstruction? We've already talked a little bit about the 10% plan. All right, so a state would then reapply for admission to the Union post Lincoln's assassination. What would they do? Well, they'd elect many ex-Confederates to office. For instance, the state of Georgia returned Alexander Hamilton Stevens to the Senate. Alexander Stevens was the vice president of the Confederacy. The state started enacting new black codes to restrict the movement and opportunities that African Americans had. The states would enact minimal compliance with the new laws and regulations. They would reject black suffrage en masse. And they engaged in political terrorism, such as endorsing or giving tacit approval to organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. And so the North reacted to the South. The North felt that the South was not acting like a defeated area. They were acting as if they were just going to go on with business as usual. And so the radicals begin to enact legislation to curtail the efforts of ex-Confederates. And this brings Congress into conflict with Andrew Johnson, because Andrew Johnson wants to have those black codes, wants to have those ex-Confederates on the legislatures and in the House and Senate. As a result of this, Congress will now take over Reconstruction. They will exert their force of will. and is called Congressional Reconstruction, also known as Radical Reconstruction. What brings about Radical Reconstruction? Riots that take place in the cities of Memphis and New Orleans and other places in 1866 see the killing of pro-Union whites, that is, Republican whites, and African Americans. When these people are killed in the cities, the Congress, dominated by the radicals, now steps up and says, enough is enough. The South's been defeated, and now they need to learn that they have been defeated. And the riots of New Orleans and Memphis in 1866 actually bring the moderates and the radicals together. And so you have more assistance given to freed slaves in the South through an organization called the Freedmen's Bureau, established by an act of Congress. Freedmen's Bureau was designed to allow and give African Americans opportunities for jobs, education, land, and so forth. One of the first things Southern whites did is they started charging it with corruption because it went against their cherished beliefs. Congress passes the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which defines citizenship. Very important, that Civil Rights Act of 1866. Defining citizenship as anyone who was born on the soil of the United States. Because remember, all these slaves that had suddenly been freed were not exactly considered citizens at this point. But the Civil Rights Act said these slaves were born on the soil of the United States of America. That makes them citizens. Secondly, the Civil Rights Act forces states to abide by federal law. States must follow federal law. Johnson vetoes the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Congress overrides the veto. And as if to make the Civil Rights Act even more lasting, Congress then passes what is perhaps the cornerstone amendment of the United States Constitution, and that is the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment defines citizenship even more strongly. However, the 14th Amendment is rather vague on black enfranchisement, which is rather interesting. The 14th Amendment is also important because here you see the first mention of gender in the Constitution. Prior to the 14th, there was no mention of man or woman. But in the 14th Amendment, you say man. And so in some ways, the 14th Amendment expands the rights of African Americans, but specifically African American men, not women. The cornerstone of the Cornerstone Amendment, the 14th Amendment, is the final clause of the amendment, and that is due process of law, that no man shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And what this means is very simple. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution of the United States, only applied to the federal government up to this point. Now it applies to the state governments, it applies to the local governments, the county governments, the municipal governments. No person can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. It was designed, therefore, to make sure that African Americans would be given all the benefits of the law. These three very dour-looking individuals are essentially the leaders of the radical Republicans and the opposition to Andrew Johnson. On the lower left is Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, a very old man by this point, House Majority Leader. He is the chief radical Republican of the House of Representatives. By the way, you see that nice shaggy mane of hair he's got on his head? That's a wig. He was cue bald underneath. Top center is Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. Charles Sumner, in the year 1854, had given a very insulting speech on the floor of the Senate in which he attacked the elderly senior senator from South Carolina, which led the senator's cousin, who was a representative, to come over to the Senate and beat him over the head with a cane. And Sumner was not able to return to the Senate for about 4 or 5 years. On the bottom right is Edwin M. Stanton, the Secretary of War. A Democrat from Ohio. Stanton comes in. At first, he is incredibly contemptuous of Abraham Lincoln, but by the time Lincoln was assassinated, Stanton was his best friend. Stanton was a very mercurial man given to fits of moodiness, and it is he who will help bring about Andrew Johnson's close downfall as president and basically his emasculation as president. The growing conflict between Congress and the president will eventually lead to Andrew Johnson's impeachment. Congress passes the Reconstruction Acts of 1867. Johnson vetoes. Congress overrides the veto. Remember, 2/3 of both bodies, House and Senate, can override a veto. The Reconstruction Acts divide the South into 5 military districts. It requires congressional approval for new state constitutions. Therefore, if a state wanted to put a new constitution in, it had to go to Congress, and Congress had to approve it, making sure there were no black codes or restrictions of suffrage and so forth. Former Confederate states gave voting rights to all men. That is, even whites had been disenfranchised in the southern states, and now all men were able to vote. If a Confederate state wished to come back into the Union, then it must ratify the 14th Amendment. Any white male who were ex-Confederates above the rank of colonel or serving in legislatures in the state or in the Confederate Congress were disenfranchised for a period of time, depending on their involvement. Many of them were disenfranchised for life. Some were disenfranchised for only a period of time. Jefferson Davis, for instance, was disenfranchised for life. Robert E. Lee was disenfranchised for life. This shows a conflict between the president and Congress, but Congress wins out. Then Congress decides to go after the executive powers of the president. It passes the Command of the Army Act in 1867, and it limits presidential control of the military, and key to this was the Tenure of Office Act. That is, if the president wished to fire or remove any of his cabinet members, it had to go through Congress first. Now, holy separation of powers, Batman, says the president. This is totally and completely unconstitutional. And so Johnson decides to try and defy Congress. He will fire his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and this turns into a circus because Stanton locks himself in his office and will not come out, not allowing the marshal to give him the notice of his firing. Because of this, Congress then impeaches Andrew Johnson on 11 counts of high crimes and misdemeanors. It then goes to the Senate. Remember, the House does the impeaching, and then the Senate tries the president. In the Senate, Johnson escaped removal by 1 vote, by a vote of 35 to 19. The radicals had been defeated, but in many ways, Andrew Johnson had been defanged. They ignored Johnson throughout the rest of his term. Andrew Johnson now had no hope of being reelected. He was a traitor to the Democratic Party because he had joined a Republican ticket, and the Republicans sure as hell were not going to nominate him. This picture shows the trial of Andrew Johnson taking place on the floor of the United States Senate. And notice the packed gallery house. And so this is the first stage in Reconstruction.